The briefing room fell silent. Major Jack Morrison stood frozen, mission clipboard suspended mid-air, staring at the B-17 pilot who had just made an impossible request. Captain David Henderson, 26 missions under his belt, repeated himself slowly, like he was teaching a child basic arithmetic. "We want the red tails, sir. Not the 52nd, not the 325th. Give us the 302nd Fighter Group for tomorrow's run to Berlin." Morrison's jaw worked soundlessly. In 18 months of coordinating bomber escorts, no crew had ever requested specific fighter protection, and they certainly never asked for the Negro pilots that half the base still called the Tuskegee experiment with barely concealed mockery. The 7 other men of Henderson's crew stood behind their pilot, faces set with the grim determination of men who understood statistics. Tomorrow they would fly deep into Germany, through 400 miles of Luftwaffe-controlled airspace, to drop bombs on factories that fed Hitler's war machine. 28 bombers would leave Italy at dawn. History suggested 6 or 7 would not return. Henderson had already lost 9 men from his original crew. His radio operator had been replaced 3 times. He was not making this request because he liked challenging authority. He was making it because he wanted to survive. "The statistics don't lie, Major," Henderson continued. 0 bombers lost in 68 consecutive missions when the 332nd provides escort. 0. Every other fighter group in this theater, no matter how many German planes they shoot down, loses bombers. The red tails bring everyone home. Morrison felt the ground shifting beneath certainties he had held his entire life. He had grown up in Georgia, where segregation was not policy but natural law, where the fundamental inferiority of Negroes was understood the way gravity was understood. Yet here stood 7 white men, Southerners most of them, requesting protection from black pilots over decorated white aces who had shot down hundreds of German aircraft. What they did not know, what nobody except a handful of intelligence officers knew, was that this moment had already happened 3 times in the past week. 3 separate bomber crews making the same impossible request. The dam was breaking. Reality was staging an armed rebellion against prejudice, and the mutiny was happening where men could not ignore it, in clear skies where survival depended on competence, not color. "This is highly irregular," Morrison managed. "Fighter escort assignments are made at division level based on strategic considerations, not crew preference." "With respect, Major," Henderson's bombardier spoke up, his Mississippi accent thick as molasses. "Strategic considerations should include getting bombers to targets and home again. The 332nd does that better than anyone. That seems pretty strategic to me." 4 months earlier, when the first red-tail Mustangs had appeared over Italy with their distinctive crimson tail assemblies, the reception had been brutal. The jokes started immediately. White pilots made bets on how long the Negro flyers would last before washing out or getting themselves killed. Some predictions gave them a week. The optimists offered 2 months. Nobody predicted excellence. Nobody imagined these pilots would rewrite the rules of fighter escort doctrine and force an entire Air Force to confront the lies it told itself about race and capability. If you're finding this story as gripping as we are, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. These untold stories of extraordinary courage deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us keep bringing them to light. The path to this moment had been paved with blood and broken B-17s. For 2 years, American bomber crews had flown into German skies in broad daylight, dropping their payloads with mechanical precision, while German fighters tore them apart. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Heavy bombers were slow, predictable targets. German fighters were fast, maneuverable killers. Fighter escorts were supposed to protect the bombers, but the white fighter groups had developed a philosophy that sounded heroic, but proved deadly. They engaged German fighters aggressively, pursuing enemies far from the bomber formations to rack up individual kill counts. Aces became celebrities. Their victories splashed across newspapers back home. Meanwhile, the bombers they were supposed to protect died by the dozens. Crews watched their escort fighters peel off, chasing glory and kills, leaving them naked against German interceptors that attacked in coordinated waves. Flying fortresses earned their name through punishment absorbed, not protection provided. Men climbed into those aircraft knowing the odds favored death or German prison camps. Captain Robert Wilson had understood these realities before he ever touched a P-51 Mustang. A sharecropper's son from Alabama who had learned to read by candlelight and earned a college degree through scholarships and summer labor, Wilson approached flying with the methodical discipline of someone who knew he would be judged by different standards. Excellence was not optional. It was survival. The Tuskegee program had trained him and his fellow pilots with intensity that bordered on cruelty. They flew more hours, endured harsher evaluations, and graduated with qualifications that exceeded white pilot requirements. Not because the instructors were generous, but because America needed ironclad evidence that black men could fly combat aircraft without getting everyone killed. When Wilson's squadron deployed to Ramitelli Airfield in Italy during January 1944, they carried the weight of an entire race on their wings. Failure would validate every racist assumption. Success might crack open doors that had been locked for centuries. The pressure was suffocating, but Wilson and his fellow pilots had learned long ago how to breathe underwater. Their commanding officer, Colonel Benjamin Davis, gathered the pilots on their first night at Ramitelli. Davis was the first black graduate of West Point in the 20th century, a man who had endured 4 years of complete silence from white cadets who refused to speak to him. He understood the mission extended beyond killing Germans. "You will fly differently than other fighter groups," Davis told his assembled pilots, his voice carrying the weight of history. "You will not pursue personal glory. You will not break formation to chase kills. You will stay with the bombers. Always and without exception. Your job is not to become aces. Your job is to bring every bomber home." Some pilots bristled at the restriction. Fighter pilots were trained to be aggressive, to seek combat and destroy enemies. Davis was asking them to be shepherds instead of wolves, to restrain their instincts and focus on protection over destruction. But Wilson understood the deeper logic. White fighter pilots could afford to chase glory because their failures would be attributed to individual shortcomings. When black pilots failed, the entire race would be judged inferior. They had to be perfect, not because perfection was required for the mission, but because anything less would be used as evidence that integration was a failed experiment. The first test came 3 days after arrival. Wilson's squadron drew escort duty for a bombing run against railway yards in Munich, deep in southern Germany where Luftwaffe fighter concentrations remained strong despite 2 years of attrition. The bomber crews who drew the 332nd as escorts reacted with visible dismay. "Great!" one B-17 pilot muttered loud enough for Wilson to hear. "We get the experiment. Guess we're the guinea pigs who find out if Negroes can actually fight." Wilson said nothing. Words were cheap and easily dismissed. Results were harder to ignore. The mission brief was straightforward. 23 B-17s would bomb Munich's railway yards at noon, destroying switching facilities and locomotives that moved German supplies to Italian and Eastern fronts. German fighters would intercept, probably in force. The bombers needed to reach the target, drop their payload, and return home. Simple objectives that killed men by the hundreds. Wilson's Mustang lifted off from Ramitelli's dirt runway at 0847 hours, climbing into cold January sky that promised clear visibility. Good for bombing, terrible for defense. German fighters would spot them from 50 miles away. The rendezvous with the bombers happened over the Adriatic Sea, 17,000 feet above water that looked black and lifeless in winter light. Wilson took position off the lead bomber's left wing, his squadron forming a defensive box that covered the formation's most vulnerable angles. The B-17 pilots maintained radio silence, but Wilson could feel their skepticism radiating through the cold air. They did not believe these Negro pilots could protect them. They were already mentally preparing for the chaos of combat, planning how to survive when their escorts inevitably broke formation and left them exposed. They did not understand yet that they were flying with pilots who played by different rules. Pilots who had studied every Luftwaffe tactic, analyzed every bomber loss, and developed a defensive philosophy that treated escort duty like chess instead of boxing. Every move calculated 3 steps ahead, every position chosen to eliminate enemy options before attacks developed. The German fighters appeared exactly where Wilson expected them, 40 minutes into the flight as the bomber formation crossed into German airspace near Innsbruck. Focke-Wulf Wundensars, 12 of them, diving from 31,000 feet with sun at their backs and speed building toward terminal velocity. Standard Luftwaffe tactics. Hit fast from altitude, slash through the bomber formation, use speed to escape before escorts could respond. It worked against white fighter groups whose pilots scattered to chase individual targets. It did not work against the red tails. Bandits, 3 o'clock high, Wilson called calmly. Blue flight, extend right. Red flight, maintain position. Do not pursue. Repeat, do not pursue. The Mustangs adjusted formation with mechanical precision, not breaking away to meet the German fighters, but repositioning to block their attack vectors. The Focke-Wulfs committed to their dive, engines screaming, cannons blazing. Wilson waited until the perfect moment, counting seconds while calculating closure rates and intercept geometry. Then he led his flight into a climbing turn that put 4 Mustangs directly between the German fighters and their bomber targets. The Focke-Wulfs broke off, unable to press their attack without flying directly through concentrated American fighter defense. They tried to circle back for a second pass. Wilson's squadron adjusted again, always maintaining position relative to the bombers, never pursuing the Germans into empty sky. The dance continued for 7 minutes. German fighters probing, feinting, looking for gaps in coverage. The red tails responding with coordinated adjustments that closed every opening. No heroic individual combat, no desperate dogfighting, just methodical, suffocating defense that gave the Germans no clean shots at the bombers. Eventually, the Focke-Wulfs gave up and dove away, low on fuel and frustrated by an opponent who refused to break formation. The bombers reached Munich unmolested, dropped their payloads with devastating accuracy, and turned for home. Not a single B-17 had taken damage from German fighters. Every bomber that left Italy returned to Italy. 0 losses. The debriefing was silent, heavy with the weight of preconceptions colliding with undeniable reality. The B-17 pilots filed their reports mechanically, unable to articulate what they had witnessed. They had expected failure and received perfection. Their worldview had no category for Negro excellence, so their minds struggled to process what their eyes had seen. Within a week, word spread through the bomber squadrons. The red tails stay with you. They don't chase kills. They bring everyone home. It was not praise exactly, more like discovery of unexpected reality, but it was the beginning of something that would shake American military culture to its foundations. Wilson knew one successful mission proved nothing. They would need to repeat this performance dozens of times, hundreds of times, until the statistics became impossible to dismiss as luck or accident. The margin for error was non-existent. One bad mission, one bomber lost, and skeptics would use it as evidence that the entire integration experiment was flawed. But if they could maintain perfection, if they could protect bombers mission after mission while white fighter groups continued losing them, then maybe reality would become impossible to deny. Maybe competence would matter more than color. Maybe survival instinct would override prejudice. It was a slim hope, but it was the only weapon they had. The second mission came 4 days later, then a third, then a fourth. Each time, the pattern repeated. German fighters attacked. The red tails defended without pursuing glory. Every bomber returned safely. By the 10th mission, bomber crews started requesting the 382nd specifically, though officially such requests were impossible. By the 20th mission, white pilots started acknowledging the red tails with radio calls and respectful nods during briefings. By the 30th mission, the statistics had become impossible to ignore. The 332nd Fighter Group was protecting bombers better than any unit in the theater. Not just better than other black units, there were no other black fighter units, but better than decorated white squadrons with triple the combat experience and 10 times the press coverage. This created profound cognitive dissonance for military leadership raised in segregated America. Their ideology insisted Negro pilots would be inferior. Reality kept demonstrating the opposite. The contradiction could not be explained away or dismissed as coincidence. It was observable, measurable, and undeniable. Somewhere in this tension between belief and evidence, Major Morrison stood in his briefing room facing bomber crews who wanted to survive more than they wanted to maintain racial hierarchies. He could refuse Henderson's request, cite regulations about division-level escort assignments, and send these men into German skies with white fighter groups that had lost bombers on 73% of their recent missions. Or he could acknowledge that the Negro pilots everyone had written off were demonstrably the best in the theater at the one mission that mattered most, bringing bombers home alive. Morrison made his decision. "I'll make the request to division," Morrison said quietly. "No promises, but I'll explain the reasoning. Crew morale, mission effectiveness, statistical performance analysis, they might approve it." Henderson nodded once, sharp and military. "Thank you, Major. That's all we're asking. Just a chance to fly with the pilots who are best at keeping us alive." After the crews filed out, Morrison sat alone in the briefing room, staring at mission reports that contradicted everything his Georgia upbringing had taught him about race and capability. The evidence was stacking up, mission after mission, each one a data point that undermined segregation's fundamental premise. The 332nd Fighter Group had flown 68 consecutive escort missions without losing a single bomber to enemy fighters. 68 missions where black pilots had performed flawlessly, protecting their charges through concentrated German opposition and heavy anti-aircraft fire. The statistical probability of achieving such a record by chance was effectively zero. Either the Negro pilots of the 332nd were lucky 68 times in a row, or they were exceptionally skilled, disciplined, and effective. Morrison had been taught his entire life that black men were intellectually inferior, incapable of handling complex tasks that required planning and precision. Yet here was mathematical proof that black pilots outperformed white pilots at the most demanding mission in aerial combat. The contradiction gnawed at him like an infected wound. He could maintain his beliefs or trust the evidence. He could not do both. Across German-held territory, similar contradictions were troubling minds at far higher levels. Luftwaffe pilots filed report after report describing unusual combat effectiveness from the red-tailed American fighters. Intelligence officers forwarded these reports up chains of command. Eventually, they landed on desks in Berlin where they created problems that extended far beyond military tactics. Adolf Hitler received his first detailed briefing about the 332nd Fighter Group in February 1944. His reaction was not strategic analysis, but ideological panic. The Führer had built his entire political movement on theories of racial hierarchy, on promises that Aryan peoples were superior to all others, particularly to Negroes, who occupied the lowest rungs of his pseudo-scientific racial ladder. Now his own military was reporting that Negro pilots were outperforming German aces, that black Americans were demonstrating tactical excellence that contradicted every assumption underlying Nazi ideology. Reality was not cooperating with the worldview Hitler had spent 2 decades constructing. The Führer's response revealed the fragility of belief systems built on lies. When evidence contradicted his racial theories, Hitler did not adjust his theories to accommodate reality. He instead demanded reality be suppressed or destroyed. He ordered propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels to develop explanations for the 332nd's success that did not involve acknowledging Negro competence. Perhaps they flew newer aircraft. Perhaps they faced weaker German opposition. Perhaps the reports were exaggerated. Goebbels tried every narrative angle, but the stories kept circulating. Too many German pilots had encountered the red tails. Too many witnesses had watched these black American pilots fly with precision that bordered on prescient. Hitler then ordered Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring to engineer massive aerial engagements designed specifically to destroy the 332nd, to inflict catastrophic losses that would disprove their effectiveness. Göring assembled tactical planning staff for operations on a scale normally reserved for major strategic objectives, all focused on annihilating one fighter squadron for reasons that had nothing to do with military necessity. It was ideological warfare disguised as military action. Hitler needed the Negro pilots to fail because their success exposed Nazi racial theory as fiction. He was willing to divert resources, sacrifice tactical advantages elsewhere, and violate strategic priorities, all to destroy evidence that contradicted his beliefs about human capability. The madness of this approach was apparent to Göring's staff, but impossible to challenge. You did not tell the Führer that his ideology was wrong, not if you valued your position or life. So German planners developed scenarios to isolate and overwhelm the 332nd through concentration of force that defied sound military doctrine. Meanwhile, oblivious to their central role in Hitler's ideological crisis, Wilson and his fellow pilots continued flying missions with relentless consistency. They escorted bombers to targets across Germany and occupied Europe. They engaged Luftwaffe fighters when necessary, always maintaining formation and bomber protection as primary objectives. And they kept bringing everyone home. The statistics climbed steadily. 70 missions without bomber losses, 80 missions, 90. Each successful mission added weight to evidence that could not be dismissed. Each safe return carved deeper cracks into segregation's foundations. Not every mission was perfect. The Red Tails lost pilots to flak, mechanical failure, and occasionally to German fighters who caught individuals separated from formation. War killed indiscriminately, and no amount of skill could eliminate risk entirely. But the bomber protection record remained extraordinary, unprecedented, and impossible to explain away through racist assumptions. By April 1944, the 332nd had become legend among bomber crews. Pilots who drew the Red Tails as escorts felt relief bordering on joy. Those assigned other fighter groups felt jealousy and occasionally dread. The bomber squadrons had learned what worked and what did not. They wanted the pilots who stayed, not the aces who chased glory. This shift in bomber crew attitudes created seismic tremors in military culture. For the first time, white soldiers were openly preferring black servicemen based on demonstrated competence. The segregation that kept Negroes in separate units, separate facilities, and subordinate positions was supposed to reflect natural racial hierarchy. But bomber crews facing death did not care about hierarchy. They cared about survival. And survival meant flying with the Red Tails. Colonel Davis received reports about bomber crews requesting his pilots with mixed emotions. Pride in his men's performance, satisfaction that excellence was forcing recognition, but also wary understanding that this created dangerous visibility. Success made targets. The more attention the 332nd attracted, the more enemies they accumulated on both sides of the Atlantic. White fighter pilots resented the implicit criticism in bomber crew preferences. If the Red Tails were best, what did that make everyone else? Southern commanders uncomfortable with integration looked for ways to discredit the 332nd's record. And across enemy lines, Hitler's obsession with destroying these pilots escalated into something approaching madness. The first assassination attempt came in May 1944. A German intelligence operative infiltrated Ramitelli airfield posing as an Italian civilian employee, targeting pilots with poisoned food. The plot was discovered before casualties occurred, but it revealed a disturbing reality. The 332nd was not just facing enemies in the air. They were fighting a shadow war on the ground against opponents who could not defeat them through conventional combat. OSS counterintelligence units arrived at Ramitelli to investigate infiltration attempts and establish security protocols. They confirmed what Davis had suspected. German intelligence had made the 332nd a priority target, not for standard military reasons, but because of their symbolic significance to Nazi ideology. The briefing from OSS Major Richard Calloway laid out the situation with clinical precision. "Hitler views your unit as proof that undermines his racial theories," Calloway explained. "He has authorized unconventional operations to neutralize the 332nd through methods outside normal rules of warfare: assassination, sabotage, psychological operations targeting morale and unit cohesion. This is beyond standard counterintelligence concerns," Calloway continued. "You are fighting opponents who cannot allow you to continue succeeding because your success destroys their fundamental worldview. They will use methods that violate military conventions because conventional warfare is not achieving their objectives." Wilson listened to the briefing with cold fury building in his chest. They were flying combat missions against Luftwaffe fighters, protecting American bombers through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, and now they had to worry about poisoned food and infiltrators on their own airbase. The layers of warfare kept multiplying because their excellence threatened too many lies that too many people needed to believe. But if this was the price of proving Negro capability, Wilson would pay it. They all would. Because retreat meant validating exactly what Hitler and American segregationists believed about black inferiority. The only way forward was through flying better, fighting harder, and refusing to surrender to fear or hatred or exhaustion. The missions continued with increased security. Armed guards patrolled Ramitelli's perimeter. Food supplies were inspected by medical personnel. Pilots traveled in groups and avoided predictable routines. The precautions were necessary but did not eliminate risk. Lieutenant Marcus Harris was killed by a sniper while walking to his quarters in June 1944, shot from distance by an infiltrator who escaped in darkness. Harris had flown 43 combat missions. He had survived concentrated flak over Vienna, dogfights with German aces, and mechanical failures that should have killed him. He died because he was a Negro pilot whose existence challenged Nazi ideology. The squadron held a memorial service in the stifling Italian heat, sweat, and tears mixing on faces that remained rigid with military discipline. Colonel Davis delivered a eulogy that balanced grief with defiance, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances under which they served. "Lieutenant Harris flew with excellence and honor," Davis said. "He protected American lives without regard for his own safety. He proved through undeniable demonstration that courage and skill transcend the artificial boundaries society constructs around race. His death diminishes us all, but his service elevated everyone who follows." The pilots returned to combat the next day, carrying grief and rage in equal measure. They flew with mechanical precision that bordered on ruthless, protecting bombers while destroying German fighters with cold efficiency. The mission was no longer just about proving capability. It had become personal. Meanwhile, in Germany, Hitler's obsession had metastasized into personal fixation that alarmed his closest advisors. The Führer demanded daily briefings on the 332nd's activities, studied reconnaissance photographs with magnifying glasses, and erupted into rages when reports indicated continued success. His inner circle watched the Führer's mental state deteriorate, energy focused not on strategic priorities, but on destroying one fighter squadron that contradicted his racial ideology. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, attempted to redirect the Führer's attention toward more pressing concerns: Soviet advances in the East, Allied invasion preparations in the West, collapsing industrial production, fuel shortages that crippled the Luftwaffe. Hitler dismissed these strategic realities to focus on tactical minutiae about the Negro fighter pilots who haunted his ideology. The red tails had become Hitler's white whale, an obsession that revealed the psychological fragility underlying his entire worldview. Every mission they flew successfully was another data point proving his racial theories were fiction. Every bomber they brought home safe was evidence that human capability was not distributed according to his pseudoscientific hierarchies. By August 1944, The 332nd Fighter Group had flown over 150 bomber escort missions without losing a single bomber to enemy fighters. The record was verified by multiple sources, documented through exhaustive mission reports, and impossible to dismiss as statistical anomaly. Black American pilots had not merely performed adequately, they had excelled beyond standards achieved by any comparable unit in the theater. This created impossible tensions in American military culture. Official segregation remained policy. Negro servicemen were legally restricted to support roles, separate facilities, and subordinate positions. Yet bomber crews kept requesting the black fighter pilots whose record proved they were the best in the theater at the mission that mattered most. The contradiction was unsustainable. Either segregation's premise was correct, and Negro inferiority would eventually manifest through the 332nd's failure, or segregation's premise was false, and the entire system of racial separation was built on lies. There was no middle ground, no way to acknowledge black excellence while maintaining belief in black inferiority. Reality forced the choice. And increasingly, bomber crews chose survival over ideology. The moment Major Morrison had dreaded finally arrived in October 1944. Division Command formally approved bomber crew requests for specific fighter escorts based on statistical performance analysis. The directive did not mention race explicitly, but everyone understood its implications. Bomber crews could now officially request the 332nd Fighter Group as escorts. The policy change seemed minor, just operational flexibility to improve mission effectiveness. In reality, it shattered a fundamental premise of military segregation. For the first time, official policy acknowledged that Negro units could be not just equal, but superior to white units. The precedent was explosive. Morrison watched bomber crews celebrate the policy change with relief that bordered on joy. They would fly with the red tails. They would have the best protection available. Their survival odds had just improved dramatically, and Morrison, a Georgia man raised on segregation and racial hierarchy, could not deny what the evidence demonstrated. The Negro pilots everyone had dismissed as an experiment had become the most requested fighter escorts in the theater. They had forced recognition through excellence so consistent that even Prejudice could not dismiss it. Something fundamental was shifting in American military culture, a crack in segregation's foundations that would widen into chasms given time and pressure. The 302nd had not destroyed Jim Crow. That battle would take decades and be fought on different fronts. But they had proven it was possible to challenge racial hierarchy through undeniable demonstration of capability. Captain Wilson stood on Ramitelli's runway at sunset, watching mechanics paint mission tallies on red-tailed Mustangs that gleamed like fresh blood in fading light. 179 missions without losing a bomber to enemy fighters. 179 times they had proven excellence. 179 data points that could not be erased or explained away. "How does it feel?" Lieutenant James Carson asked, joining Wilson on the tarmac. "To be the pilots everyone wants?" "Complicated," Wilson admitted. "We've proven what we needed to prove. That competence transcends color, that excellence is measurable and real. But we're still going back to an America where I can't eat at half the restaurants or stay at most hotels. We protected white bomber crews who will return home and vote to keep us segregated." Carson nodded slowly, understanding the bitter irony. "But we've given them evidence they can't ignore. When they tell their families and friends about the Negro pilots who saved their lives, that creates cracks in the narrative. Maybe small cracks, maybe taking decades to widen, but real nonetheless." Wilson wanted to believe that, wanted to think their sacrifice meant something beyond personal survival. The evidence they had created was undeniable. Mission reports, bomber crew testimonials, statistical records verified by multiple sources. Future generations would study this record and understand that claims of racial inferiority were lies. But in October 1944, those future generations felt distant. The immediate reality was exhaustion, grief for lost friends, and knowledge that the war against prejudice would continue long after Germany surrendered. They had won battles in the air and fought shadow wars on the ground, all while representing something larger than themselves. The weight was crushing. Still, as Wilson watched the sun disappear behind Italian mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson that matched their Mustang tails, he felt something approaching satisfaction. They had done what they set out to do. They had proven excellence under impossible circumstances. They had established a record that nobody could dismiss or diminish. And somewhere in Germany, Hitler was choking on the reality that Negro pilots had dismantled his racial ideology through simple competence. That was victory enough. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally, its armies defeated, its cities ruined, its Führer dead by suicide in a Berlin bunker, while Soviet shells reduced the capital to rubble. The 1,000-year Reich Hitler had promised lasted 12 years and left Europe in ashes. Captain Robert Wilson stood on Ramitelli's tarmac on VE Day, watching mechanics paint final victory symbols on the red-tailed Mustangs that had carried them through 2 years of combat. The 392nd Fighter Group had completed 200 bomber escort missions. They had damaged or destroyed 409 German aircraft, and they had maintained the most exceptional bomber protection record of any escort group in the war, flying 179 missions where not a single bomber under their protection was lost to enemy fighters. The statistics were undeniable, verified by multiple sources, confirmed through exhaustive documentation. Black American pilots had not merely performed adequately, they had excelled beyond standards achieved by any comparable unit. They had forced an entire military to confront the lies it told itself about race and capability. But VE Day celebrations felt muted for Wilson and his fellow pilots. They had won the war against Germany, but they were returning to an America where segregation remained legal, where Jim Crow laws denied them basic civil rights, where the same nation they had fought to protect refused them service at restaurants and hotels because of skin color. Colonel Davis gathered his pilots for a final briefing as the unit prepared to redeploy stateside. "What we accomplished here will echo for generations," Davis said. "We forced people to choose between belief and evidence, between ideology and survival. Many chose survival. That's not victory over prejudice, but it's a crack in the wall, and cracks widen. We're going home as heroes who will be treated as second-class citizens," Davis continued. "That injustice is real and bitter, but we're also going home with a record that cannot be disputed. We have evidence, we have testimony from white bomber crews who owe us their lives, we have statistics that prove excellence transcends artificial categories society imposes. The civil rights battles ahead will be fought in courts, legislatures, and streets. We've fought our battles in the air. Our contribution is evidence, undeniable, documented, impossible to dismiss except through willful blindness. That evidence will be ammunition for those who continue the fight for equality." Wilson absorbed Davis's words, recognizing their truth while struggling with the incomplete victory they represented. They had proven Negro capability beyond any reasonable doubt. Yet that proof had not immediately changed American society. Progress would be measured in decades, not days. Still, something had shifted. Bomber crews who had flown with the Red Tails returned to their hometowns, carrying stories about Negro pilots who saved their lives. Those stories circulated in communities across America, creating cognitive dissonance between racist assumptions and lived experience. Seeds planted that would eventually grow into broader recognition of fundamental human equality. The journey home was bittersweet. They flew as decorated veterans who had served their country with distinction, returning to a nation that still denied them equal rights. The contradiction was obscene, but they had learned to carry contradictions. Negro servicemen had been doing so for generations. What made this different was the evidence they carried: mission reports, statistical records, testimonies from white soldiers, documentation that proved segregation's premise was false, that human capability was not distributed according to racial hierarchies, that excellence could emerge from any community given opportunity and training. This evidence did not immediately integrate the military. That would take President Truman's executive order in 1948. It did not immediately secure voting rights. That required decades of civil rights activism and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But it became part of the accumulated proof that segregation was unjust, that racial hierarchy was fiction, that America's stated ideals contradicted its lived reality. Years later, historians would study the Tuskegee Airmen's record and recognize its significance extended beyond military achievement. The 332nd Fighter Group had participated in a larger battle about human potential and the lies people told themselves about racial hierarchy. Their success did not immediately change American society, but it provided ammunition for civil rights advocates who fought those battles in venues where excellence alone could not guarantee victory. The deeper legacy was what happened in those bomber formations over Germany and occupied Europe. The moment when white soldiers facing death chose competence over color. The requests for red-tail escorts that contradicted every racist assumption they had been taught. The recognition, however grudging, that survival mattered more than ideology. Those moments revealed something profound about human nature and social hierarchy. When stakes were clear and consequences were immediate, when life depended on performance rather than prejudice, people chose capability over skin color. The artificial barriers society constructed around race collapsed under pressure of observable reality. This did not mean racism disappeared. Prejudice proved remarkably resilient, adapting new forms when old justifications failed. But the Tuskegee Airmen had demonstrated that racism's premises were false, that claims of Negro inferiority could not survive contact with evidence. That demonstration mattered. Hitler's response to their success revealed how threatening evidence could be to ideology built on lies. The Führer had committed resources, violated military conventions, and descended into obsession trying to destroy pilots whose existence contradicted his worldview. He failed. Reality proved stronger than ideology, and the Negro pilots he tried to eliminate outlived him by decades. As Wilson's transport aircraft lifted off from Italian soil for the final time, he looked down at Ramitelli Airfield growing smaller beneath him. 2 years of his life had been spent at that base, fighting multiple wars simultaneously. He had lost friends, survived assassination attempts, and participated in one of history's most significant demonstrations that human capability transcended racial categories. The victory was real but incomplete. The war had ended, but the larger struggle for recognition of fundamental human equality would continue for generations. The Tuskegee Airmen had won their battles, but the war against prejudice required continued fighting on different fronts. Still, they had accomplished something extraordinary. They had forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. They had created evidence that could not be dismissed. They had proven that when your life depends on competence, prejudice becomes a luxury nobody can afford. The bomber crews who begged for the red tails instead of white aces had not suddenly become racial progressives. They had simply chosen survival over ideology, evidence over assumption. But that choice, repeated hundreds of times across dozens of bombing missions, created cracks in segregation's foundations that would eventually bring the entire structure crashing down. It would take time. Brown V's Board of Education was 9 years away. The Civil Rights Act was 19 years distant. Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington would not happen for 18 years. But the evidence the Tuskegee Airmen created became part of the accumulated proof that segregation was unjust, that racial hierarchy was fiction, that America could become better than its past. Wilson carried that knowledge home, along with memories of friends lost and battles won. He carried the satisfaction of excellence achieved against impossible odds. He carried evidence that would outlive everyone who tried to suppress it. And he carried the hope, painful, fragile, but unextinguished, that the cracks his squadron had created in segregation's foundations would widen into channels for genuine change. That the bomber crews who chose red tails over aces would remember that choice when they returned to communities where prejudice remained policy. That maybe, just maybe, when people were forced to choose between belief and evidence, some would choose evidence. And that choice, repeated enough times across enough communities, might eventually transform a nation. It was a slim hope, but it was real. And sometimes, when the odds are impossible and the enemy seems invincible, a slim hope is the most powerful weapon available. The Red Tails flew home carrying that hope along with their exceptional record. They had proven what needed proving. Now others would continue the fight they had started, armed with evidence that could not be denied. If this story moved you, drop a like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. And please share in the comments which moment struck you most. Was it the bomber crews requesting black pilots over white aces, the statistical record that could not be dismissed, or Hitler's obsession revealing ideology's fragility? Your engagement helps ensure these heroes' stories reach the audiences they deserve.